My name is Sloane Mercer. I am 34 years old. The night of my sister's charity gala, my mother introduced me to the executive director of the Hartwell Foundation with a smile so practiced it could have been carved in marble. She gestured toward me with one hand, the way you gesture toward a side dish that came out lukewarm, and said, "And this is Sloane. She works at a grocery store." That was it. No last name, no context, no professional title. Just a grocery store, delivered in the tone of someone noting mild weather. The executive director smiled politely, shook my hand, and turned back toward my sister Adrienne. I stood there in my navy dress, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching 200 people in that ballroom network and glitter, and never once wonder who I was. What they didn't know was that they were standing inside a building I owned. Every marble tile beneath their feet, every vaulted ceiling above their heads, every table draped in white linen and set with crystal that caught the chandelier light. All of it sat on a piece of land that bore my name on the deed. The Hartwell Grand, one of the most sought-after private event venues in the state of Connecticut, with a waiting list that stretched 18 months and a nightly rental rate that started at $38,000, was mine. Had been mine for 3 years. The grocery store was the first business I ever purchased. The venue was the 7th. And the combined valuation of my real estate holdings and business assets, as of the last formal assessment 6 months prior, sat just above $58 million. My mother had no idea. Neither did my sister Adrienne. They had stopped paying close attention to me a very long time ago, and I had stopped volunteering information to people who weren't listening. This is that story. Before we go any further into the evening of the gala, I want to pause and ask you something. Where in the world are you watching or listening to this right now? What time is it there? Drop your city and the time in the comments below, because I genuinely love knowing that these stories are reaching people in different corners of the world at all different hours. Whether you are in a kitchen in Lagos, or on a commute in London, or sitting up late on a couch in Ohio, I am glad you found your way here. If stories about women who were underestimated and quietly became extraordinary resonate with you, please like this video and subscribe to Revenge Diary. Every episode we publish is a reminder that the quietest women are often carrying the loudest secrets. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Not to the gala. To a suburb of Hartford, Connecticut called Wethersfield, where I grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial on Birchwood Lane, with a mother named Patricia Mercer, a father named Douglas, and a sister named Adrienne, who was, from the day she was born, the official sun of our family's solar system. Adrienne was 3 years older than me, and everything that implied in a household that organized itself around visible achievement. She had my mother's high cheekbones and my father's easy confidence, and the particular gift of making every room she entered feel like it had been waiting for her. She was never cruel to me, not exactly. Cruelty would have required intention, and Adrienne operated entirely on instinct, which was far more corrosive because it was never calculated. She didn't dismiss me on purpose. She simply moved through life, assuming that wherever she stood was the center, and if I wasn't visible from that center, I had ceased to matter. She had many friends, was popular in every school she attended, joined every committee she encountered, and left a warm impression on everyone she met. She was genuinely likable. That was what made the dynamic between us so difficult to name. You cannot be angry at sunlight for not knowing it is blinding you. My mother, Patricia, was the architect of the family's particular hierarchy, even if she never acknowledged it as such. She was a woman who had grown up beautiful and had organized her entire personality around the social benefits of that fact. She joined the right clubs, wore the right shoes, cultivated the right friendships, volunteered at the right organizations. She understood social status, the way a jeweler understands light. Every facet, every angle, every way it could be caught and redirected. When Adrienne grew up with charm and magnetism and eventually married a man from the right kind of family, Patricia treated it as a personal achievement. When I grew up quieter and more interested in spreadsheets than dinner parties, she treated it as a mild disappointment she had chosen to accept with grace. She did not dislike me. She simply found me less legible than my sister. And what my mother could not immediately read, she filed under unremarkable. My father Douglas was a kind man and a passive one. He loved me, I believe, in the way you love a piece of furniture you chose yourself, with quiet, unspoken satisfaction, that never quite became enthusiasm. He worked in commercial insurance and traveled frequently, and when he was home, he read history books and watched baseball and deferred to Patricia on all matters involving his daughters. He died of a heart attack when I was 26, 2 days before I closed the deal on my second commercial property. I never got to tell him what I was building. I think about that sometimes, on the drives between properties, in the quiet of an empty building I am about to transform. I wonder whether he would have been proud the way he was proud the night of the business competition. I think he would have been. I carry that with me. Let me give you several specific examples of what growing up in that house actually looked like, because single incidents never tell the whole story. It is the accumulation that shapes you. When I was 16, I won a regional business competition run through the high school in partnership with the Hartford County Chamber of Commerce. I had spent 4 months developing a proposal for a hypothetical neighborhood co-op grocery that would serve lower-income zip codes with fresh produce at below-market prices through a member ownership model. I presented it to a panel of actual local business owners and municipal officials, and I won first place. The prize was a scholarship check for $2,000 and a framed certificate printed with my name in gold. The ceremony was on a Tuesday evening at the chamber offices downtown. My mother had a charity committee meeting she had committed to months prior. Adrienne was at a volleyball tournament out of state. My father drove me, sat in the third row of a room of about 60 people, and clapped the loudest in his section when they called my name. Afterward, he took me to a diner on New Britain Avenue and bought me a milkshake and said I had done something real. It was one of the best evenings of my life. When we got home, I put the certificate on the refrigerator with a magnet. My mother walked past it the next morning, said, "That's sweet, honey," and never asked about it again. When I was 20, working 2 jobs while finishing my business degree, one at a grocery distribution company handling logistics, one at a property management firm doing administrative and financial analysis, I began to see a pattern. The properties the firm managed were not complicated. They generated income through rent, and the income was predictable if you managed the leases and the maintenance carefully. It seemed, to me, like a learnable system. I began running financial models in the evenings on a laptop I had bought secondhand. I read 14 books on real estate acquisition, commercial development, and property financing in 1 calendar year. I listened to every podcast I could find. I stayed late at the management firm and asked questions of anyone who would answer them. By my senior year, I had a clearer sense of how to buy my first property than I had of what I was going to do after graduation. I called my mother one Sunday in November to share some of this. I told her I was thinking about buying a small commercial property as a first investment. She said, "Don't be silly, Sloane. You don't know enough about real estate to be buying things. You should talk to Greg, Adrienne's boyfriend, the one who does mortgages. He knows people in finance." Greg Whitmore was 24 years old at that time, working for a regional mortgage broker, and had not yet demonstrated any of the financial reliability that a person giving advice about investment might want to project. I thanked my mother and hung up the phone and never mentioned the plan to either of them again. When I was 23, Adrienne got engaged to Greg at a dinner party my parents hosted at the Birchwood Lane house. The party had 43 guests. There were catered appetizers and a string quartet and a photographer moving through the rooms. My mother cried happy tears during the toast. My father raised his glass and looked pleased. 3 weeks later, having told no one, I quietly closed on a mixed-use property in the south end of Hartford, a 3-story building with a vacant retail space on the ground floor and 2 residential apartments above it. I paid $312,000, financed with a commercial loan from a local bank and a down payment I had saved over 2 years of aggressive budgeting. I renovated the retail space over 60 days and leased it to a boutique cafe on a 5-year triple net lease. The cafe moved in on a Thursday. That same Thursday, Adrienne called to talk about wedding venues. I listened and offered suggestions and did not mention the transaction I had closed that week. Not because I was ashamed, because I had learned by 23 that my family was not the audience for my life. They had auditioned for that role and decided against it. I had accepted their decision and built accordingly. The South End property was the beginning of everything. Over the next 11 years, I built a real estate and business portfolio quietly and methodically, the way you build anything intended to last, by understanding each piece before acquiring the next, by letting the income from one investment fund the acquisition of the next, by never moving faster than my knowledge could support. The cafe lease covered the mortgage on the South End building, which I refinanced 18 months later and used as collateral to purchase a larger commercial building in Glastonbury. That building housed 3 tenants: a physical therapy practice, an accounting firm, and a specialty insurance agency. Combined, they generated $11,400 per month in rent, against a monthly debt service of $6,200. I banked the difference and kept watching the market. A Middletown property followed, then an acquisition in New Britain that I purchased, distressed, and stabilized over 8 months. I brought in a business partner briefly on a mixed-use development in Newington, operated it successfully, and dissolved the partnership cleanly when our objectives diverged. I kept building alone. By the time I was 28, I had 6 income-producing properties and a net worth of just over $4 million. By 31, I had 12 properties, 2 of which I had developed from the ground up on land I had assembled through adjacent parcel acquisitions, and my net worth had grown to $19 million. I had hired a full-time property manager named Richard, a bookkeeper named Deborah, and a real estate attorney named Vivian Park, who had become both my legal counsel and, in the way that serious working relationships sometimes do, one of my closest confidants. Through all of this, I kept my position at the grocery chain. I had started there at 22 as an assistant produce manager, working part-time while finishing my degree, and I had grown with the company steadily and deliberately over the years. By 29, I was a district manager responsible for 4 stores in central Connecticut. By 32, I was the regional operations director overseeing 11 stores across Connecticut and western Massachusetts, with a team of 47 direct and indirect reports, an annual operating budget exceeding $60 million, and a salary plus bonus package that most people in my personal life would have found surprising. I liked the work. I was good at it in a way that was different from how I was good at real estate. More kinetic, more people-facing, requiring a different kind of intelligence. I kept the 2 sides of my professional life entirely separate. My real estate portfolio was held through a series of LLCs, structured to protect both privacy and liability. My name appeared on county property records, but you had to be looking to find it. Nobody in my family was looking. This is where the Hartwell Grand enters the story. 3 years before the gala, I identified a decommissioned estate property on 12 acres in Simsbury, Connecticut. The main building was a 1920s-era manor house, 18,000 square feet, stone exterior quarried locally, a grand central hall with original oak floors and 20-foot coffered ceilings, 6 fireplaces, a formal library, a carriage house converted decades earlier to a garage, a caretaker's cottage, and formal gardens that descended toward a private pond. The property had operated as a corporate retreat center in the 90s, then sat vacant for a decade, while a disputed estate worked through probate. The heirs had finally settled, and the property came to market with a listing price of $4,600,000. I spent 3 months analyzing the financials, the local event market, comparable venues in New England, and the restoration cost estimates. I made an offer of $4 million flat. After 2 rounds of negotiation, we settled at $4,200,000. I closed in October. The restoration and conversion took 14 months and cost $2,900,000 additional dollars. I hired a preservation architect out of New Haven who specialized in historic properties. We restored every original element worth preserving: the oak floors, the carved millwork, the stone fireplace surrounds, the coffered ceilings. We rebuilt what could not be saved to match the period character of what remained. We installed new electrical, new plumbing, a commercial-grade HVAC system, a professional catering kitchen with a 12-burner range, and 2 commercial convection ovens, a climate-controlled wine storage room that could accommodate private collections for long-term events, and a restored ballroom that comfortably seated 300 for a seated dinner or accommodated 400 for a cocktail reception. The 6 bedrooms on the upper 2 floors were converted to private overnight suites for wedding parties and multi-day corporate events. The carriage house became a secondary event space, suitable for 50 guests, available for private use, or as a bridal preparation suite. The gardens were redesigned by a landscape architect to be functional for outdoor ceremonies from May through October, while requiring minimal off-season maintenance. I named the property the Hartwell Grand after the road it sat on. I opened a hospitality LLC to operate it, hired an event director named Carol Sims, who had spent 15 years managing premium venues in New York and Boston and knew the industry from the inside out, built a website, established relationships with every major event planner and florist and catering group in the Hartford market, and accepted our first bookings in January. By the following October, our first full year of operation, the Hartwell Grand had hosted 47 private events, 9 weddings, 14 corporate functions, 12 charity galas, 8 milestone celebrations, 4 private concerts. Our waiting list stood at 62 clients. Our net operating income for the year was $1,400,000. The venue had become exactly what I envisioned when I first stood in that dusty, silent 18,000-square-foot building with its oak floors gray from years of neglect and its coffered ceilings draped in cobwebs, and thought, this is something. I never told my mother. I never told Adrienne. My mother knew I worked at a grocery store, which was technically accurate in the way that describing the ocean as water is technically accurate, and for reasons I will now explain, I had made no effort to correct her. The Hartwell Foundation Charity Gala invitation arrived in my mailbox in February, 9 months before the event. Adrienne had joined the foundation's board the previous year. The Hartwell Foundation was a regional arts and education nonprofit that funded youth programs across 4 Connecticut counties, including literacy initiatives, after-school arts programs, and college access counseling. Adrienne had become the board's fundraising chair within 6 months of joining, which surprised no one who knew her, because Adrienne moved toward the center of every room she entered until she was running it. She had worked hard on the gala and deserved credit for it. The gala was the foundation's annual flagship fundraiser. The previous 2 years, it had been held at a country club in Avon with solid results. This year, the country club had double-booked the date with a corporate block reservation that took precedence, and the foundation's event committee was left without a venue on 3 months' notice. The Hartwell Grand received the inquiry call on the last Tuesday of February. Carol answered. She confirmed availability, sent our venue package, arranged a site visit with the foundation's executive director, a woman named Frances Aldridge, and by mid-March we had a signed contract. $55,000 for a Saturday evening in November, full venue use including the ballroom, the carriage house space as a cocktail reception area, and 3 of the private suites for committee member use during the event. Carol managed every detail of the booking as she managed all our bookings, with complete competence and warmth. I knew the moment Carol showed me the contract whose event this was. The foundation's name was sufficient, but I also recognized the address listed as Adrienne's home address. I said nothing to Carol about the personal connection. I signed the venue agreement, filed it, and returned to my other work. What I did next, I did deliberately. Not with malice, not with any plan to embarrass or humiliate my family, but with the clear-eyed recognition that I had spent 34 years being invisible to the people who should have seen me most clearly, and that this particular evening offered something I had never been given before, the circumstances to simply stand still and let the truth land on its own. I called Frances Aldridge directly in April. I introduced myself as the owner of the Hartwell Grand and told her I intended to be personally present on the evening of the gala to ensure the event ran smoothly, a practice I followed for events of this scale and prominence. Frances was warm and genuinely appreciative. She mentioned that she had heard the venue had new private ownership and that the restoration had been extraordinary. "We're so grateful you were available on such short notice," she said. "We were worried we'd have to scale back significantly." I told her the team would ensure the evening was everything the foundation needed. Then I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she planned to make any remarks welcoming the venue and major donors at the start of the program. She said yes. She always opened the formal portion of the evening with brief acknowledgments. I thanked her, confirmed she had my direct contact information, and said I looked forward to meeting her in November. Then I went back to work and did not think about the evening again for several months. I did not rehearse a speech. I did not plan a dramatic reveal. I simply scheduled it in my calendar the way I scheduled every other event on the property and let the months pass normally. What did those months look like? Ordinary, mostly. In May, Richard flagged a roof issue on the Glastonbury building, and I approved the repair contractor within 48 hours. In June, Carol and I met with a prospective wedding client whose family had a guest list of 320, and whose expectations required careful managing. We worked through the logistics over 4 hours and ultimately signed a contract worth $64,000 for the following September. In July, I drove to Western Massachusetts for 2 days to address a personnel situation at one of the stores, resolved it cleanly, and drove home. In August, my mother called to give me a detailed update on the progress of the gala's silent auction, including the names of the items that had been donated and their estimated values. I listened and said the right things. I did not mention that I had just gotten off a call with Carol about the catering partner for the gala's dinner service, which we had confirmed with a Hartford restaurant group whose executive chef I had worked with before and trusted. In September, Vivian Park sent me a memo outlining a possible acquisition in the Farmington Valley she thought I should consider. I read it the same evening and called her in the morning with 3 follow-up questions. We began preliminary due diligence in October. Through all of it, the gala remained in my calendar, unremarked upon, as ordinary as any other booking. That was the only discipline required, to treat it like the professional event it was, and not like the personal one it also happened to be. I visited my mother for Sunday dinner twice a month through that spring and summer. Adrienne's gala planning was a recurring subject at every table. The centerpiece design, she had gone back and forth between tall arrangements and low ones for 3 weeks. Before landing on the low pedestals, Carol had independently selected for the venue. The silent auction committee, the keynote speaker who had initially committed and then canceled, and the replacement they had identified through a board member's connection. The dress Adrienne had commissioned from a designer in New Haven, champagne-colored, draped neckline, precisely the gown she wore that evening. My mother discussed all of it, with the focused enthusiasm she brought to anything that reflected well on Adrienne, leaning forward, using her hands, filling in every detail. I sat across from her and listened, and asked the right questions at the right moments, and occasionally refilled my wine glass from a bottle I had brought, a Sonoma Coast Chardonnay from the Hartwell Grand Cellar that Carol had added to our house selection 6 months prior. I did not mention that detail. I did not mention any detail. I listened and nodded and drove home along the familiar route from Wethersfield and slept well. Now I want to pause here for just a moment because I know some of you are still watching this and you know exactly what that feeling is. You are the one in your family who does the serious work and builds the real thing and yet somehow still ends up standing in the corner of someone else's party being introduced as an afterthought while the person holding the microphone has never once asked what you actually do. If that is you, drop a comment below right now. Tell me your version of this story. And if you haven't subscribed to Revenge Diary yet, please do it now. Because what happens next, the moment Frances Aldridge crosses that ballroom floor, is the reason I finally decided to tell this story out loud. The evening of the gala arrived cold and clear in early November, the kind of Connecticut evening where the sky turns navy before 5 o'clock and the air carries wood smoke and frost and the smell of leaves that have already fallen. I drove to Simsbury alone, arriving at the Hartwell Grand at 4:15 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the first guests. I walked every room with Carol. The ballroom was extraordinary in the way it always was on event evenings, but more so that night because I knew who was coming. The chandeliers threw warm light against the stone walls. The florist had run low arrangements of ivory roses and burgundy dahlias down the center of each table on pewter pedestals. 200 settings of our ivory and gold china were laid out with precision. The bar was stocked and staffed. The kitchen was operational. Every room smelled of fresh flowers and beeswax polish. Everything was exactly right, because Carol had made it so. I changed in one of the private suites on the upper floor. I had brought a dress I had owned for 2 years and never found occasion to wear. Midnight blue, long-sleeved, understated in cut and material, the kind of dress that does not announce itself but reads as entirely correct in any serious room. Small diamond earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. Low heels. I did my own makeup the way I always did, which is to say efficiently and without drama. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. I thought, you built this building. You belong here. Then I went downstairs. I came down at 6:15, just as the first guests were arriving. I took a position near the entrance to the main hall. Not prominently, just present. I greeted the catering team. I confirmed the timing of the first course with Carol. I spoke briefly with the foundation's event coordinator, a young woman named Priya, who was managing the program timeline with admirable focus. Then I stepped to one side and watched the room fill. 200 people over the next 45 minutes, arriving in the careful evening clothes of people who take charity galas seriously. The women in gowns and the men in dark suits, and everywhere the particular social energy of a fundraising event, all warmth and purpose and strategy layered together. My mother arrived at 6:32 with Adrienne and Greg. Adrienne looked beautiful, as she always did at events she had organized. A champagne-colored gown with a draped neckline, her dark hair pinned up, a pearl choker. Greg wore a suit that fit him adequately. My mother was in deep burgundy, her posture carrying the particular erectness of a woman who is proud of her child and wants every person in the room to register that fact. I watched them from across the entrance hall as they came through the doors. My mother scanned the room in one practice sweep, the assessment of a woman who has attended hundreds of events and knows exactly what she is looking for. Her gaze passed over me once, then twice, then settled. She crossed the room. "Sloane, I didn't know you were coming tonight." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. Adrienne came behind her, gave me a brief hug with the warm but distracted energy of a woman whose mind was tracking 100 details. "You look nice," she said. Greg shook my hand and mentioned something about the drive from Hartford. At 6:47, Frances Aldridge approached our small cluster near the entry hall. She was a woman in her late 50s, silver-haired, with the decisive energy of someone who had run a significant nonprofit through multiple economic cycles and not only survived but grown. My mother extended her hand first. "Frances, I'm Patricia Mercer, Adrienne's mother. We spoke on the phone about the silent auction logistics in September." Frances smiled. "Of course. Adrienne has been such a tremendous asset to the board this year." Then she turned toward me and I saw the moment of recognition cross her face. Not surprise, but the specific pleasure of a prepared person encountering a person they have been looking forward to meeting. Before Frances could say a word, my mother filled the half-second gap with her voice. "And this is Sloane. She works at a grocery store." Frances looked at me. I looked at Frances. I smiled. Frances went still for exactly one beat. The beat of a woman who has just registered a significant gap between description and reality. And then she smiled back, but differently. Not the polite social smile she had offered my mother, something warmer and more particular. "Sloane Mercer," Frances said. Not a question, a confirmation. A woman who had spoken with me on the phone in April and had communicated with Carol for months and had signed a $55,000 contract, placing her foundation in my care for the evening. "Yes," I said. "It's wonderful to finally meet you in person." Frances turned to my mother, and she spoke with the natural confidence of someone who is simply sharing accurate information. "Mrs. Mercer, your daughter owns the Hartwell Grand. We're standing in her building." My mother's face did not fall gradually. It fell the way something heavy falls. Suddenly, completely, with a sound you do not quite anticipate. "I'm sorry?" "Sloane is the owner of this property," Frances said. "She has been extraordinarily gracious to the foundation tonight. We're enormously grateful she was available on such short notice, and the restoration she has undertaken here is simply remarkable." She looked back at me with genuine warmth. "I've attended events in most of the major venues in this state and several in Boston and New York. What you've done with this property is genuinely exceptional work." "Thank you," I said. It was about 3 years from acquisition to the opening, a lot of decisions along the way. It shows in every detail. The cluster of people who had been orbiting our conversation at the polite radius of cocktail hour proximity had gone quiet. I was aware of it in my peripheral vision, the small adjustments of bodies stilling, the turning of attention. Adrienne was looking at me, not glancing, looking. With the full focus, she rarely directed my way. Her mouth had opened slightly. Greg was staring at the floor. My mother had not moved. She was holding her champagne glass at an angle that suggested she had forgotten entirely that it was in her hand. Frances said she needed to check in with Priya about the program timeline and excused herself warmly, but not before saying that I should absolutely be seated at the head table for dinner. I said I would be honored. Frances moved away into the room, and I stood in front of my mother and my sister and did not say one word, because nothing needed to be said. The building said it. The marble floors said it. The chandeliers and the restored oak and the ivory china and the $55,000 contract said all of it, more eloquently than I ever could have managed. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Adrienne broke it. "You own this place." Her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of someone processing information that has arrived in the wrong order. "Yes," I said. "Since 3 years ago." "And you never said anything." No one asked. Adrienne looked around the ballroom, the chandeliers, the stone walls, the florist's low burgundy arrangements running down each table. She looked the way people look when they realize the map they have been using does not match the territory. "How?" she said, not demanding, genuinely at a loss. How long have you been doing this kind of thing?" 11 years, I said. The first property was in the South End. I built from there." "Sloane," she said. And then she stopped. Whatever she intended to say, she could not find where it ended. My mother spoke. Her voice, when it arrived, was smaller than I had ever heard it. "You never told us." "No," I said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "Mom, every time I mentioned my work you changed the subject, or told me to ask Greg, or said I didn't know enough about business. I stopped bringing it up." She looked around the room slowly, reassessing every surface, understanding that this was not a venue her daughter had rented, or been invited to, or wandered into as a guest. This was her daughter's. "The grocery store," she said. "That's real too," I said. "I'm the regional operations director for 11 stores. I've been in that role for 4 years. She didn't answer. She stood in the middle of the room her daughter owned, holding a glass of champagne her daughter's event director had selected, and for the first time in my memory, my mother had nothing to arrange. Frances Aldridge opened the formal program at 7:30 from the podium at the front of the ballroom, the foundation's logo projected on the screen behind her. The room quieted with the particular efficiency of a crowd that has been to enough galas to know when to stop talking. Frances thanked the board, the major donors, the catering team, the floral designer, the silent auction committee. She spoke about the foundation's programming and the year's impact numbers, and what the evening's fundraising would support. And then she said, "Before we move to dinner, I want to offer particular and personal gratitude to tonight's venue. The Hartwell Grand is one of Connecticut's most extraordinary privately owned event spaces, and we are privileged to be here this evening as guests of its owner. Sloane Mercer has been with us tonight ensuring every detail was exactly right, and I want this room to know that the warmth and professionalism of the Hartwell Grand team has made our job easy and our evening magnificent. Sloane, would you please stand?" 200 people looked at me. I stood. I did not make a speech. I did not look at my mother. I simply stood, nodded once with a small smile, and sat back down. The room applauded, the genuine kind, not the polite kind. From across the table, I could feel my sister watching me. I looked at Adrienne then, and her expression was not resentful or competitive or wounded. It was something more complex and more honest than any of those things. It was the look of a person who has just understood something they should have understood a long time ago, and is still deciding how to feel about that understanding. Dinner was served. The kitchen performed exactly as Carol had planned. The first course was a roasted beet and goat cheese composition that 4 people at my table mentioned separately and unprompted. The main course arrived on time. The wine service was smooth. The auction raised $243,000 for the Foundation's youth programs, a 42% increase over the prior year, which Priya came to tell me about with visible delight around 9:30. I sat at the head table next to Frances, and we talked for most of the meal about the restoration process, about the acquisition financing structure, about what I looked for in a distressed property, about the event industry in New England, and where I saw it heading. It was a professional conversation of the kind I had regularly with investors and partners and advisors. That evening, in that room, in front of 200 people who had just learned who I was, it felt like something I had been waiting a long time to have in the right place. My mother found me near 10 o'clock in the corridor outside the ballroom. She was alone. Her lipstick had worn off and her evening was showing on her face in the way that long evenings do. The small signs of a person who has been processing something significant for several hours and has not finished. She looked, for the first time I could recall, like herself rather than like the performance of herself. She stood in front of me and did not smile. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Yes," I said, not with anger, just with honesty. "I didn't know," she said. "I understand that, but there's a difference between not knowing and not asking." She closed her eyes briefly. "I didn't ask, because I had already decided I knew the answer. You decided the answer was grocery store. I decided the answer was limited. I thought you were steady and reliable and not this." She looked at the corridor walls, the stone and the restored millwork, and the sconces I had chosen one by one during an afternoon with the lighting designer 3 years ago. "I am steady and reliable," I said. "That's not a smaller thing than what Adrienne is, it's a different thing. I built all of this by being steady and reliable." She didn't answer that. She looked at the floor for a long moment. "Your father would have been so proud," she said. Her voice broke on the last word. "I know," I said. "He always was." She looked up. "Sloane, I am sorry. For tonight. For every Sunday when you tried to tell me something and I wasn't listening. For the competition certificate on the refrigerator. For all of it." She meant it. I could hear that she meant it. "I know," I said again. "That's a beginning." The fallout came quietly, in the way things do when they happen to people who have a reputation to manage. In the days after the gala, my mother called twice and I let both calls go and listened to the voicemails in the morning. They were not polished apologies. They were attempts, halting and genuine, which I appreciated more than polished would have been. The third time she called, I answered, and we talked for 45 minutes. She asked questions she had never asked before. How did the first property financing work? What did it feel like when the cafe signed its lease? Was I frightened during the Hartwell Grand Restoration when the costs ran higher than projected? I answered all of them. At the end, she said, "I want to understand what you've built, all of it, from the beginning." "Okay," I said, "we can do that." Greg Whitmore called me 4 days after the gala. It was a Sunday morning, unusual. His voice had the careful tone of a man who has had time to think. "I want to say I had no idea," he said, "about the venue, about any of it. Adrienne's been pretty quiet since the gala, and I think she's processing a lot." "She's allowed to take her time with it," I said. "I know," he said. "I also want to say what I said a few years ago about you not knowing enough about real estate. That was arrogant, and I'm sorry. I did not tell him it was okay, because it had not been okay. But I thanked him for saying it and wished him a good Sunday and hung up the phone. That was a sufficient resolution. Not every repair needs to be complete to be real." Adrienne called on a Thursday evening 11 days after the gala. She asked if she could come to the Hartwell Grand. Not for an event, just to see it properly, as herself, without 200 people around. I said yes. She came on a Sunday afternoon in December. Carol was off that day, and I walked Adrienne through every room myself. I showed her the original oak floors I had insisted on preserving when the contractor recommended replacement. The carriage house conversion. The catering kitchen I had designed with the chef consultant around workflow rather than aesthetics, which had made Carol's job substantially easier. The private suites on the upper floor where, the week before, a wedding party of 12 had spent the night. The gardens that in December were skeletal and dormant but whose bones I described so she could understand what they would be in May. Adrienne listened differently than she had listened to me at any point in our lives I could remember. She did not reach for her phone. She did not redirect the conversation toward herself. She asked questions that were not about her. "What was the hardest moment?" she said, standing in the center of the restored ballroom with the December light coming through the tall windows. "Deciding to do the Hartwell Grand," I said. The numbers worked on paper, but it was more capital than I had deployed on anything before, and it was an entirely new category of asset. I spent 3 months second-guessing myself. She absorbed that. "And you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." "Did you ever think about telling us?" I considered the question honestly. "I thought about it." And then I remembered the last time I tried to tell Mom about a property, and she told me to call Greg. And I decided the work would speak for itself when it was ready. Adrienne was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I know I've never paid enough attention. And I know that's the understatement of the year given what I'm standing in." "It is," I said, "but I accept it." She looked at me then, with an expression I had never seen directed at me from her face. Something like respect, real respect, the kind that does not need to announce itself. "I'm proud of you," she said, genuinely. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. "I want to speak directly to you now. If you are someone who has been building something alone, a business, a career, a version of yourself that your family has not seen because they stopped looking a long time ago. The invisibility was never a measure of your value. It was a measure of their attention. These are entirely different things, and it is important that you not confuse them, because one of them is about you and one of them is entirely about them. You are not less than what they see. You are simply more than what they were willing to look for. The work you do in silence is not diminished by their ignorance of it. In many ways, silence is the best possible condition for building something real, because no one is there to doubt you aloud, to introduce their fear into your plans, to tell you what you don't know enough about. The invisibility that hurt you is also, quietly, your protection. And there will come a moment, not always as dramatic as the one in this story, but a moment nonetheless, when the truth lands in the room without you having to carry it there. When that happens, you do not need to make a speech. You do not need to be triumphant. You only need to be exactly who you have already become, standing exactly where you have built your way to standing. That is enough. It has always been enough. I still work at the grocery chain. The Monday after the gala, I was at my desk by 8, reviewing a store performance report for the Glastonbury location and approving a vendor contract for the following quarter. My mother called that evening and asked how my day had gone. I told her about the inventory review. She asked a follow-up question about how distribution logistics worked across 11 stores. It was a small conversation, and it was not small at all. The Hartwell Grand's second year of operation is tracking 31% ahead of year one bookings. Carol has been given a meaningful raise and a small equity stake in the Hospitality LLC, which she received with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has earned exactly what they asked for. The Farmington Valley acquisition is in late-stage due diligence. A mid-century estate on 8 acres with different architectural bones than the Hartwell Grand, but similar structural integrity and similar potential. I expect to close in the spring. The portfolio continues to grow steadily the way it always has, one decision at a time. Nothing dramatic, nothing announced. Just the work, compounding quietly into something real. My grandmother used to say, whenever I visited her after school and sat at her kitchen table watching her balance her small household ledger with a pencil and a patience I have never stopped admiring, "Sloane, the people who are the loudest about what they're worth are usually spending down the principal." I have carried that sentence with me for 20 years, through every acquisition and every renovation and every Sunday dinner where I sat and listened and said less than I knew. It is the truest piece of financial wisdom I have ever received, and it had nothing to do with money, it had to do with character. The people who told me I didn't know enough about real estate, the people who introduced me as just a grocery store worker, the people who walked past the certificate on the refrigerator, they were spending down something too. The difference is that what I was building was accumulating the whole time. I think she would have liked walking through the Hartwell Grand. I think she would have done it slowly, the way she did everything, with her hands behind her back and her eyes taking in every detail. The original oak floors, the restored coffered ceilings, the stone exterior, she would have run her hand along. And at the end, she would have stopped in the middle of the ballroom and looked at me and said, "You did this." Not a question, not an exclamation, just a recognition offered quietly to another person who already understood that the quiet ones are not the small ones. They never were. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the one your family overlooked? The one introduced as the afterthought? The one whose work was invisible until it was impossible to ignore? Have you ever built something in silence, while the people who should have been your first audience looked the other way? Tell me. Drop it in the comments below. Even just a sentence. Because every woman who was dismissed and kept building anyway deserves to be heard, and this community is one of the places where that happens. I read every comment. Every single one. To everyone who watched this all the way through, thank you from the bottom of my heart. This channel was built for you. For the woman who has been doing extraordinary things in quiet rooms, while someone else got the applause. For the daughter who was introduced as an afterthought at her own family's events. For everyone who has ever smiled politely and said nothing when they could have said everything. You are not invisible here. Every episode we publish at Revenge Diary is a love letter to the women who build in silence and arrive without warning. Please subscribe if you haven't already, share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and come back tomorrow for the next story. Because there is always another one, and every single one of them is worth telling. I will see you then.